Hi, this is the third and final in a series of short lectures that I'm giving on the book Fields of Blood by Karen Armstrong, specifically on the chapters we're reading in this class. And what I'm trying to do is sort of gives a brief overview of some of the main concepts that you'll see emerge from Armstrong's work and where they're placed in, so how the context of the time and the ideas of these religions often sort of warp and impact and mutate each other. So starting off again, a reiteration of Armstrong's core theme to her whole work is that religion as an idea is not inherently violent, that people and certain sort of power structures of governance wind up being violent. And as a result of these sort of frameworks of society, frameworks of governance, and frameworks of culture, those being inherently violent, any religion that is sort of present in or seeks to interact with or seeks to sort of, coexist alongside that imperial vision is going to get sucked up into it and will thus wind up having violence written into its framework and written into sort of its core, but that one can start pulling those threads out as you look at the history of the tradition and start seeing that the violence is not the tradition itself, but it's imported in. Okay, so we're looking at in chapter 7 and 8 the rise, or the founding of Islam, the rise of the caliphate and of the Muslim empires, and then how those empires eventually wind up clashing with broadly Christian empires in the Crusades, and how that sort of winds up masking itself. Now, I don't need to go into a lot of great depth here because, frankly, we've already covered a great deal of the core ideas that Armstrong has, in the book in previous lectures, and also because these chapters are rather self-explanatory. And we have spent, as a culture, a great deal of time trying to wrestle with this concept of, crusaderism, and generally as a framework, Christianity has post-Crusades rejected the idea of crusading and has seen it as inherently antithetical to Christianity. But it's important to see why crusading winds up becoming core to medieval Christianity at a very specific time, and how it eventually starts to fade away. But first, just a quick overview of chapter 7, which is this sort of rise of Islam and some of the core themes that are emerged from it. So Armstrong in chapter 7 gives starts off with a background of life in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically the city of Mecca and the area around Mecca, which is where the Prophet Muhammad is actually coming from. So Armstrong gives a good sense of context into the world that the Prophet Muhammad, lives in and works in, and this is a very this is a world that is dominated by the tribal system of the Bedouin people and of the Arabian Peninsula generally, and this is not a way of life that is in any way sort of really new to Armstrong's work in the Fields of Blood. This idea of how do you resolve inequality in an area like Arabia where you can't really grow food, where you're mainly herds people, where you're mainly doing livestock. You sort of see what's happening, in the first chapters of Armstrong, where she's sort of talking about there being this inherent conflict between, the sort of tribes of herdsmen versus the agricultural stability in empires. You see that instead this is a society where you only have herdsmen. You only have the instability of that livestock lifestyle. So you see an emergence of almost like one could say it, what like Armstrong makes like frames it this way, a proto-capitalism where you see an entire society built around trade and built around livestock and sort of built around the concept of the raid, the raiding party, which exists as an idea to restabilize any inequality that exists on in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, this is a society with strong family and clan ties, rooted in trading, and this entire economy itself winds up being built around raiding, as opposed to raiding being an occasional thing. It has it moved and shifted and evolved to where it actually becomes the entire economy. It's all built around this raiding, where you have little bits who are like tribes who are raiding against each other constantly, and the tribes view themselves as their sole identity is linked to their tribe, and that the tribes have to sort of coexist in this difficult sort of landscape of one could say like trying to negotiate existing in a precarious space. So in this context, we see Muhammad start to have visions of being spoken to, being sort of given these revelations from the angel Jibril, which eventually become, when they're packed together and sort of pieced in sort of this edited way, become what is known as the Holy Quran. Now, a core theme of the Quran is again, sort of reflecting the theme of the Abrahamic God generally, as we see in Yahweh moving in through Christianity and now into Islam, is a rejection of the systematic violence which is inherent in structures, in political structures. And in this specific context, it's the rejection of the systematic violence which is inherent in the structures of the Meccan economy. Inequality, rampant poverty, etc. You see Allah rejecting the raiding culture and insisting on all these tribes actually being unified under submission to the one God, that there is an obedience that is emphasized, that in order to get rid of this tribalness, Allah is actually saying, I am the God of all, and that you must all submit equally before me. And that you must, sort of rid yourself of a lot of this structural injustice in your society, which is, designed to, create a ruling class over an underclass. The Quran really has a very practical focus on the elimination of structural inequalities and injustice. So, Armstrong gives a brief history of the rise of Islam. We don't really need to go into much detail. Armstrong covers it in great detail. But incidents like the Hijra, the sort of movement from of the Muslims from Mecca to Medina, the development of a uniquely Muslim concept of community, the Ummah, which is again sort of an overarching universalist or a universal community that breaks down tribal barriers, Muhammad's development as a leader, and the impact that his dual role of both prophet and political leader will have on the future of Islam and its political theology. So at one level, you see this sort of this coexistence of religious leader and prophet and political leader within Muhammad's personality and Muhammad's life and actions that impact the Quran, that impact how Islam generally views political action, and the role of the divine in political action. To a certain extent, you see more than the other two Abrahamic traditions. You see in Islam this direct sort of statement of, let's make the kingdom of God, this will of Allah, actually existing in actual political structures, and then with the Quran stating how that should be, and then with the study later of how Muhammad deals with these political challenges, winds up laying the stamp of how is Islam going to rule itself politically. So you see laying this sort of this groundwork of Islam being inherently a truly political theology, which is dealing with directly how one runs a society and how one governs and rules a society that is seeking to move away from structural injustice in a way that Christianity kind of touches on in its scriptures, but not nearly to the full extent that you see in Islam. Now, Armstrong did a little bit of the development of the Quran as a sacred document, in that it is literally the words of God spoken by the angel Jibril, and Muhammad writing them straight up down. Not going to go into too much detail there, except to say that there's a strong undercurrent of profound respect of the Quran as these literally being the words of Allah, and the impact that has on future Islam. You can sort of see in this way that the Quran is still sort of seen as determinative in a way that not every Christian is going to agree with the Bible being as determinative. Now, the Quran is incredibly complex, and Armstrong gives a little bit of background on how Muhammad's context impacts the revelations, how the revelations change over time, reflecting different times and contexts. And the challenge this goes to anyone who is seeking to develop a cohesive and coherent, but a cohesive is there is a coherent Islamic vision, but not a cohesive one that sort of has, certain through lines that run all the way through it, a cohesive Islamic view of violence based in the Quran. Now, some of the other, the context of all this that we're seeing is that the Ummah experiences significant growing pains. You see the conquest era, occur. You see the rift between the Sunni and the Shia. You see the development of a Muslim caliphate, and also you see the rise of the Muslim empires and a series of Muslim empires. And again, we don't need to really go into detail there. Armstrong covers it pretty well, but again, Armstrong demonstrates in this chapter the challenges which are inherent in running an imperial state, while also trying to hew closely to core fundamental ideals that may run counter to the power and structural imbalances that are inherent in running an empire. You've got nonviolence, egalitarianism, protection of the vulnerable, alongside running a imperial state. They don't align, and that is a challenge that Armstrong sort of talks about the Muslim empires having to wrestle with. In chapter 8, here we are. We're at the Crusades. I almost don't really want to go into too much detail on this, because this is kind of the time whenever anyone wants to say, let's look at religion as inherently violent, and they look to Christianity, they look at the Crusades, and they look at the quote-unquote wars of religion between the 1500s all the way up to like the 1600s. So like you're looking at 16th, 17th century time frame. And they're going to say, okay, this is proof of religion being inherently violent. But if you're already been tracking how these themes have played out through other empires, and we've been following and we've been laying down this theme, this inherent theme that the closeness with violence and religion might actually be much more of a human desire than one which can be ascribed to sort of the divine beings that are sort of surrounding the context of these political figures. You can see that in a lot of ways the Crusades was a political statement. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and then, of course, in the East, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, you have a development of a feudal system, which provides order and structure to a decentralized rural society in Western Europe. The church, as a result of sort of the destruction of the sort of the overwhelming political power of the Roman state, remains strong, and as a result, it winds up becoming sort of almost by default the main political power. In a way, it sort of develops this sort of political entity of itself in this vacuum. Now, it already had a strong political element when it was a part of the Byzantine Empire, and beforehand in the Roman Empire, that the state and the empire were sort of running alongside each other. But it was always the empire which had the greater power. When the empire goes away, the church just still exists. It's always been there. So by default, it becomes the power player. It becomes one of the key, literal kingmakers of Europe. And that has a number of consequences. Now, Armstrong's main themes, which she's been tracking the entire time, of power, corruption, the ideals of a society wrestling with the realpolitik of, this sort of this day-to-day grind of an imperial state. The political and economic power which, sort of plays out against the, the religious ideals of nonviolence and egalitarianism and equality, sort of winds up sort of, leaving the church in the state where it's landowner, and it is political player, and it is the most rich of any entity around, and people look to it for stability and, as a final arbiter of all disputes. So it almost, in a way, it gets sucked into being, sort of maintaining power because no one else is able to do so. Now, into this time frame, you see the, and very quickly, I'm just going to cover this, this rise of the knighthood problem. So as you see sort of this, this system which is built upon or around primogeniture, where you have, the first son getting all of the goods, because you have to give it to somebody. You have these second and third and fourth sons of these noble families who wind up, having to do something. So they either go into the church or they become soldiers and they become knighthoods. They become knights. And the knights wind up, having nothing to do, and they're kind of conquering Europe. So, you see the first popes starting to emphasize, sort of push the idea of crusade in part as a way to resolve a political problem. Let's get these knights something to do. And there may be sort of an idea of wanting to ensure that Christians can return to the Holy Land, sort of a rediscovery almost of the Holy Land, as you see Europe start to sort of trading with areas of the East. They start to see, hey, actually, there is this place called the Holy Land, we should go there. And you see this marrying, over time, of the needs of, European churches and kings to sort of solve a social problem of knights, aligned with this, this idea of having a convenient religious excuse of, reconquering the Holy Land. And thus, in a way, the Crusades almost occur as if by accident, where you see the Crusades starting to sort of, they become these convenient ways of sort of solving this social problem. But once they're rooted, once you have societies with, once they have a literal kingdom in Israel, in sort of in Palestine area, they then need to be defended. And once that becomes the case, then you have just a straight up war between people who are, trying to maintain the power in that society, the Christians who have these states, and then you have the Muslims who say, well, it is our land, and we want to reconquer it. So you have, at that point, just purely a question of empire versus empire. And in some ways, one can say that the Crusades are, much less complicated than one would think. They're incredibly complicated as sort of how they came about, but a lot of it is really, if you've been following Armstrong all the way through, with the Crusades, you see this culmination of this question, where you start to see this this clash of civilizations, where these two inherently violent traditions, Christianity and Islam, fighting against each other, and Christianity trying to push Christianity upon the Muslims. And at some level, sure, inevitably you're going to want to impose some sense of your beliefs on somebody else, but you're doing so because you're already there as a political entity. And Armstrong sort of concludes that chapter, and we kind of conclude our discussion of Armstrong at that point of looking at how are the Crusades not what we think they are. And we're going to stop at that point. We're going to be having these discussions, moving forward, about what is jihad and how does it connect with crusading, and these are really profoundly interesting questions. But really, the point is just to stick with this Crusades and see how Armstrong has made this argument. Are these traditions inherently violent? Is the just war tradition, this idea of like having a just war, how is that sort of similar to the concept of jihad? These are really interesting questions to engage with, and we will. But in terms of these lectures, the idea is, has Armstrong made a point? And I leave that to you.